The humidity in the air was suffocating, thick with the smell of scorched earth and damp charcoal. Hundreds of people were gathered in the dirt lot of the Miller estate, their eyes fixed on the charred, twisted metal hunk sitting on a rusted trailer. It was a safe, or what was left of one after the inferno that had leveled the manor 3 months prior. The auctioneer's gavel struck the wood, his voice dripping with condescension as he mocked the silence. Then, a single hand went up. A frail, calloused hand belonging to Silas, an old farmer who owned nothing but grit. $90. The crowd erupted in laughter, but that night, the laughter died. The laughter wasn't just a brief ripple, it was a wave of collective derision that washed over the gravel lot. To the gathered crowd, Silas was an anomaly, a man from a bygone era, wearing denim that had seen more decades than most of the attendees had seen birthdays. He stood there, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick, his face a map of deep-etched lines. They saw a man who had lost his own farm to debt years ago, a man who, in their eyes, was simply trying to hoard scrap metal to sell for pennies. They didn't see the history behind his eyes, nor did they understand the silent, rhythmic pulse of the life he had lived. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't offer a rebuttal, nor did he shrink under the weight of their judgment. He simply watched the auctioneer, a man named Henderson, whose silk tie seemed entirely too clean for the dust of the rural auction circuit. Henderson was a showman, a man who built his reputation on the spectacle of broken lives. When he had first unveiled the safe, he had turned it into a theatrical performance. He treated the piece not as a relic of tragedy, but as a prop in a comedy show. The safe was a blackened, distorted cube, stripped of its paint by an intense, chemical fire that had claimed the lives of the estate owners. It looked like a tomb, heavy and unyielding. A remnant of a secret that the universe had tried to incinerate. The auction continued around him, but for Silas, the world had narrowed down to that singular, heavy object. He had spent his life reading the soil, understanding the hidden things that moved beneath the surface, the roots, the worms, the slow erosion of stone. He knew that when something is buried or burned, it isn't necessarily destroyed. It is merely transformed. The crowd's mockery was noise, a superficial distraction that meant nothing to a man who understood the value of stillness. When the final hammer fell and the safe was officially his for $90, the auctioneer shared one last wink with the crowd. It was a gesture that said, "Look at what the poor old fool bought, a paperweight for his regrets." Silas didn't hire a truck. He brought his own, a battered, pre-war Ford pickup that rattled with every revolution of its engine. He backed it up to the trailer with a precision that bordered on the artistic. It took him nearly an hour to winch the safe into the bed. He didn't rush. He didn't grunt. He worked with a systematic efficiency that seemed to mock the haste of the modern world. As he strapped it down, the metal groaned, a deep, resonant sound, like a dying animal. It was a cold sound, vibrating through the truck's chassis and up into his very bones. The drive back to his farm was long. The road snaked through the valley, past the dilapidated barns and the fading fences that marked the edge of his property. He felt the weight of the safe pushing down on the rear axle, a tangible burden that mirrored the weight in his chest. For years, people in town had whispered about the Miller estate. They spoke of missing fortunes, of gold bars and rare coins that were rumored to have vanished in the night, only for the owners to be found in the ashes. The local police had combed the property for weeks, finding nothing but oxidized steel and charcoal. They had assumed the fire was so hot, so all-consuming, that it had liquidated everything of value. But Silas knew better. He knew about fires, and he knew about the nature of containers. He knew that steel, no matter how scorched, has a memory. He pulled into his yard, the gravel crunching beneath his tires as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across his porch. The silence of his farm was absolute, save for the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant call of a night owl. He had lived alone since his wife passed 5 years ago, and the house had become a cavern of quiet memories. He didn't head inside. He headed straight to the barn, the place where he kept his tools, not the modern, power-driven equipment, but the hand-forged instruments of a master craftsman. He unhitched the safe and moved it onto his workbench, a slab of thick oak that had been in his family for 3 generations. As he cleaned the soot from the dial, the true extent of the damage became clear. The heat had warped the door, fusing the tumblers in a way that would have stumped even the best locksmith in the city. It was a fortress of carbonized steel, a silent vault that had guarded its secrets through the flames. Most people would have taken a torch to it, or used an angle grinder to hack through the casing. Not Silas. He picked up a magnifying glass, his hand steady as stone. He began to listen. He pressed his ear against the metal, ignoring the grime, and started to rotate the dial. He wasn't looking for numbers, he was looking for the ghost of the mechanics within. He was speaking to the machine, asking it to remember its own architecture. The night air had turned crisp, biting into the edges of the open barn doors. Silas sat on his stool, his breath hitching in a rhythmic cadence that mirrored the turning of the rusted dial. Most safes are designed with a specific architecture of security, a series of pins, wafers, and heavy-duty steel bolts that engage in a dance of precision. But this safe was different. It had been forged in a crucible of extreme heat, and the metal had undergone a molecular shift. The tumblers weren't just stuck, they were frozen in a state of thermal expansion, locked by the very energy that had tried to destroy them. To anyone else, the safe was a dead weight. To Silas, it was a complex, locked puzzle, a mechanical corpse waiting for the right touch to reveal its secrets. He didn't use force. He understood that metal, when heated and cooled rapidly, developed stress points, microscopic fractures and structural weaknesses that are invisible to the naked eye. He treated the task with the same patience he had applied to nursing a failing crop through a drought. He knew that if he forced it, the internal locking mechanism might collapse into a permanent, irreparable bind. He needed to be surgical, almost spiritual in his approach. He began by applying a light, specialized lubricant, a mixture he had concocted decades ago from whale oil and kerosene, specifically designed to penetrate microscopic gaps. He worked it in with a syringe, his movements microscopic. The smell of the oil hung in the air, sharp and pungent, blending with the musty scent of the barn. He then took a small, copper mallet and began to tap. Tink. 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 The sound was erratic, a staccato rhythm that seemed out of place in the crushing silence of the farm. He wasn't trying to break the lock, he was trying to vibrate the pins, to nudge them just enough to overcome the friction of the warped metal. Hours melted away. The clock on the wall, a pendulum relic from another century, marked the passing of time with a hollow, rhythmic thud. Outside, the moon climbed high, casting a pale, spectral light through the barn windows. Silas felt a change in the resistance. The dial, previously stiff and stubborn, gave a microscopic shudder. A tiny, nearly imperceptible click echoed through the casing. He stopped. His heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He closed his eyes, centering himself. He had spent his entire life in a state of financial scarcity, yet he had never been truly poor. He possessed a wealth of patience that the modern world had long forgotten. He turned the dial again, this time with even greater finesse. The mechanism sighed. It was the sound of iron relinquishing its hold. He felt the internal bolts retract, not with the smooth glide of a factory-new safe, but with the grinding, protest-heavy resistance of a beast awakening from a long, painful sleep. He stood up, his knees popping from the cold and the long hours of hunched concentration. He stood before the safe, his hand hovering over the heavy, blackened door. It was the moment of truth. What had the Millers been hiding? Why had the safe survived when everything else was reduced to ash? He grabbed the handle. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been chilled by the void inside. He pulled. It didn't budge. He braced his foot against the workbench, his muscles straining as he pulled with all his strength. With a sound like a gunshot, the vacuum seal broke. The door swung open, hinges screaming in protest. A rush of air escaped from the interior, stale, dry, and smelling faintly of ozone and something metallic, like ancient copper. Silas shone his flashlight into the cavernous dark. There were no gold bars. There were no bundles of $100 bills. The interior was lined with asbestos fireproofing that had largely held, protecting what lay within. At the bottom of the safe sat a single, leather-bound ledger and a small, velvet-lined box. Silas reached in, his hands trembling for the first time. He pulled out the ledger first. The leather was brittle, flaking away under his touch. He opened it carefully, the pages yellowed and fragile as butterfly wings. It wasn't a bank record or a deed. It was a diary, a meticulous, almost obsessive account of the Miller estate's history, dating back to the late 1800s. As he flipped through the pages, he realized he wasn't looking at a fortune in cash, but something potentially more dangerous. The diary contained names, dates, and amounts, a ledger of local debts, favors, and political influence. It was a history of the valley written in the shadows, detailing how the Miller family had built their wealth not through agriculture, but through an intricate web of loans, blackmail, and coerced land sales. They had been the silent landlords of the entire region, pulling strings from their manor, deciding who survived and who was forced to fold. Silas read the final entry, dated the very day of the fire. The handwriting was erratic, hurried, as if the person writing it had been terrified. "They know," it read. "They've come for what they're owed." The realization hit him like a physical blow. The fire wasn't an accident. It was an extraction. And he, by buying this safe, had just inherited a ghost story that had been buried for 3 months. He wasn't just a farmer with a curiosity, he was now the keeper of the valley's darkest secret. The auction crowd had laughed because they thought the safe was empty. Silas now understood that it was full of a truth that could level the local establishment to the ground. The gravity of the ledger's contents settled over the barn like a thick, suffocating fog. Silas sat back on his stool, the small flashlight flickering as he stared at the final, jagged sentence in the diary. "They know." The implications began to cascade through his mind. If the fire had been a targeted act of violence, a way to settle a debt that couldn't be paid in currency, then the people behind it were still out there, potentially still operating within the very circles that had laughed at him only hours ago. The "they" mentioned in the diary wasn't some abstract threat, it was a cold, institutional reality. He turned his attention to the second item he had pulled from the safe. The small, velvet-lined box. It was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested. As he pried the lid open, the hinges groaned, giving way to reveal not jewels or coins, but a series of thin, glass-like plates. They were photographic negatives, ancient and delicate, layered with fine, silver-halide crystals that had captured images of a time long forgotten. He held one up to the light of his lamp. It wasn't a family portrait. It was a map. Or rather, it was a series of geological surveys, hand-drawn and annotated with specific markers that he recognized instantly. These were the original property lines of the valley, dating back to the turn of the century. But there was something else marked on them: water rights. In this part of the state, water was more valuable than gold. Whoever controlled the underground aquifers controlled the fate of every farm for 50 miles in any direction. Silas stared at the markers. He had spent years watching his neighbors struggle, watching their wells go dry while the Miller estate's fields remained lush and vibrant, even during the harshest droughts. Now, he understood why. The Millers hadn't just been land-rich, they had been water monopolists, legally siphoning the valley's lifeblood through a series of hidden, illegal boreholes that hadn't appeared on any public record. The fire hadn't been about money. It had been about the erasure of evidence. They who came for the Millers were clearly the entities that had been losing money, land, and livelihood for decades. And now, the proof was in the hands of a man who had been marginalized by that very same system. Silas felt a strange, cold clarity. The laughter in the auction lot, the condescension of Henderson, the businessman, it wasn't just arrogance. It was fear. They had all known, on some level, that the safe was a liability. They had hoped it would stay sealed, that the fire would do its job permanently. He walked to the window and looked out across his own fields. The soil was dry, thirsty. His family had been forced to sell half their land 20 years ago when their primary well failed. He had blamed the drought, his own misfortune, his lack of resources. But as he looked at the map in his hand, he realized that his failure had been engineered. He wasn't a victim of climate or chance, he was a casualty of a calculated, multi-generational scheme. The rage that bubbled up inside him wasn't hot or impulsive, it was a slow-burning, tempered steel. It was the kind of anger that built structures, that stood against storms, that refused to be eroded. He knew he couldn't just keep this information. To hide it would be to perpetuate the cycle. But to reveal it? That was a dangerous game. He was an old man, alone on a farm that was already failing. If he went to the authorities, who would listen? The very people he would be accusing were likely the ones who held the keys to the town's political and legal machinery. The sheriff, the mayor, the regional land board, they were all beneficiaries of the status quo. To challenge them would be to invite the same fate that the Millers had met in the heat of that inferno. He spent the remainder of the night cataloging the evidence. He found deeds, receipts, and correspondence that traced the corruption back through 3 different administrations. It was a complete, documented history of a crime that had spanned a century. He realized that the reason the safe had been so difficult to open wasn't just the fire, it was the weight of the secrets it held. The mechanics of the lock had been a physical barrier to an objective truth that everyone had collectively agreed to ignore. As the first light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of violet and bruised orange, Silas made his choice. He wouldn't sell the documents. He wouldn't use them to leverage a payout. He would do something far more disruptive. He began to prepare his old truck. He didn't need a lawyer, and he didn't need the police. He needed the one thing that had always been the ultimate enemy of the corrupt, transparency. He was going to turn the valley's secrets into a public broadcast. The laughter from the auction house was about to be replaced by a silence so profound that it would force the entire county to reckon with its own reflection. He started the engine, the roar echoing across the valley floor, signaling the beginning of an ending that nobody had anticipated. The engine of the old Ford pickup sputtered, coughed a cloud of black smoke, and then settled into a steady, rhythmic idle that rattled the loose panels of the barn. Silas didn't pack a bag. He didn't lock the house. He only took the leather-bound ledger and the box of glass negatives. These were his weapons now. He climbed into the cab, the worn leather seat sagging under his weight, and gripped the steering wheel with hands that felt younger, steadier than they had in years. He knew the path he had to take, not the path of least resistance, but the one that led directly into the heart of the town's artificial peace. He drove past the sleepy, shuttered storefronts of the county seat as the sun fully crested the hills. The town felt brittle, as if its entire facade were held together by nothing more than habit and mutual avoidance. He pulled up in front of the local newspaper office, the Valley Clarion. It was a small, struggling publication that had been bought out years ago by a holding company, one of the many shell companies listed in the Miller Ledger. Silas knew the editor, a young woman named Elena who had once tried to run a series on regional water shortages, only to have her work spiked by the owners. He parked on the sidewalk, right in front of the window, and stepped out. He didn't look like a man about to topple a local oligarchy, he looked like a tired farmer with nothing to lose. When he walked through the door, the bell chimed, thin and lonely. Elena was at her desk, buried under a pile of press releases and local sports scores. She looked up, her expression tired and resigned, until she saw the look in Silas's eyes. There was a sharpness there, a piercing intensity that stripped away the small talk she usually used to deflect the world. "Silas?" she asked, her voice cautious. "What brings you out so early? Did the tractor give out again?" "The tractor is fine," Silas said, placing the ledger on her desk with a heavy, deliberate thud. The dust from the safe still clung to the leather, leaving a dark smudge on her pristine mahogany desk. "I bought a safe at the Miller auction yesterday. The one everyone laughed at." Elena stared at the ledger, then at the box of negatives. She didn't touch them. She looked at Silas, her eyes widening as the potential reality of the situation began to dawn on her. "Silas, you have no idea what that is, do you?" "That estate was burned," Silas finished. "I know. I know who burned it, and I know why. I know why the wells went dry, and I know who has been signing the checks for the last 40 years. He opened the ledger to a random page and pushed it toward her. Elena's eyes scanned the entries. As she read, her face went through a transformation. The boredom vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. She flipped a few pages, her hands beginning to shake. This wasn't just a rumor or a wild accusation, it was a paper trail. It was evidence of criminal collusion, water theft, and political bribery on a scale that would make national news if it ever broke the surface of the local information bubble. "If this is real," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "This isn't just a story, Silas. This is a demolition. People will try to bury this. They'll try to bury you." "They already tried," Silas said calmly. "They tried to burn the truth in that safe. But fire changes things, Elena. It reveals the core. I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to do your job. The job you wanted to do when you first took this desk." He pulled out the glass negatives and held one up to the morning light filtering through the office blinds. The detailed map of the underground aquifers, with their illicit boreholes and diversion valves, was etched in black and white. It was an undeniable, objective reality. It wasn't subject to the political spin of the city council or the soft peddling of the regional water board. It was the land itself showing the truth. "I've spent my life watching this valley wither while others grew rich on our thirst," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a storm. The laughter at that auction wasn't just mockery. It was the sound of a system that thinks it's untouchable. It thinks it's buried its crimes deep enough to be forgotten. "But I found them. And now, I'm giving them to you." Elena looked at the ledger, then at the camera mounted on her shelf. She was a journalist, and she had spent her career serving a machine that fed on her own silence. The silence was, for a moment, absolute. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to grow louder, counting down the seconds of the old order. She reached out and touched the cover of the ledger, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering. The decision she was making was final. It was a bridge being burned, or perhaps, it was the lighting of a beacon. "We'll need more than just these," she said, her voice growing firmer. "We'll need to cross-reference these names with the county records. If we're going to do this, we do it in a way that can't be stopped. We go digital, we go national, and we don't hold back a single word." Silas nodded. He didn't smile. He felt the weight in his chest beginning to lift, replaced by the cold, clear resolve of a man who had finally done what was necessary. The auction house had laughed at a $90 bid, thinking they were bidding on a pile of worthless, charred metal. They hadn't realized that the value of an object isn't determined by its appearance, but by the truths it holds, protected and waiting for the right moment to be brought into the light. The next 3 days were a blur of frenetic, high-stakes activity. Elena, the editor, had effectively turned her office into a bunker. She brought in a trusted friend, a retired archivist with a penchant for investigative ethics, and they worked in shifts, digitizing the ledger, scanning the delicate glass negatives, and cross-referencing every name, property boundary, and financial transaction with public land records. Silas stayed in the office, his presence a silent, grounding force. He didn't offer input, but his encyclopedic knowledge of the local land, every ridge, every hidden stream, every failed homestead, provided the context that made the dry facts bloom into a devastating narrative of systemic theft. The town, meanwhile, remained oblivious. The local elite continued their routines, meeting at the diner for coffee, discussing the upcoming elections, and laughing at the absurdity of the crazy old man who had spent his life savings on a pile of rust. They didn't notice the strange, quiet tension building in the periphery of their lives. They didn't see the way the local sheriff started getting restless, or how the real estate developers began double-checking their legal filings. The secret was moving through the wires, traveling from the scanned documents in a small-town office to servers across the country. By the 4th day, the files were prepared. They had built a repository, a digital archive that couldn't be deleted, couldn't be suppressed, and certainly couldn't be ignored. Elena had arranged for the story to break simultaneously across a network of independent investigative outlets. She wasn't playing by the local rules of the Clarion anymore. She was bypassing the gatekeepers entirely. As she hovered over the Publish button, she looked at Silas. He was staring out the window, watching the town square with a look of profound, detached peace. "Are you ready?" she asked, her hand trembling slightly over the keyboard. "Once this goes live, there's no going back. They'll come for the ledger. They might come for us." Silas turned to her. "They've been coming for us for 100 years, Elena. The only difference is now we're looking them in the eye." With a single click, the silence of the valley was shattered. It started as a trickle of notifications, social media pings, inbox alerts, and then, slowly, the phones began to ring. The story, titled The Burned Vault, A Century of Stolen Water, hit the internet with the force of a tectonic shift. It wasn't just a local news piece, it was a masterclass in investigative journalism. The scans of the ledger, the maps revealing the illegal boreholes, the detailed list of every official who had taken a bribe to look the other way, it was all there, laid out in undeniable, high-definition clarity. The fallout was instantaneous. By noon, the county courthouse was swarmed, not by protesters, but by state investigators and federal auditors who had been alerted by the sudden spike in the story's reach. The local sheriff, caught in a live interview attempting to downplay the allegations, crumbled when the interviewer began quoting the specific dates and transaction codes from the ledger. The mask of authority slipped, revealing the terrified, complicit man underneath. The laughter that had defined the auction lot was replaced by a frantic, scrambling silence as the architects of the valley's misery realized their secret was no longer a secret, it was a public record. Silas stepped out onto the sidewalk, the air outside feeling remarkably different. It was the same heat, the same dust, the same scent of dry earth. But the weight of the valley had shifted. He walked back to his truck, the engine of which had become a symbol of his quiet defiance. He didn't stick around for the fallout. He didn't want to watch the men who had mocked him be led away in handcuffs. That wasn't why he had done it. He had done it because the truth was a debt that had been owed to the land itself, and he had simply acted as the collection agent. As he drove back to his farm, he saw the transformation. People were coming out of their homes, not with fear, but with curiosity. They were talking to one another, looking at the land they farmed with new eyes, connecting the dots of their own hardships. The cycle of secrets had been broken. The water, the literal and metaphorical lifeblood of the valley, was finally, legally, and permanently moving toward a new, transparent future. He reached his barn and pulled the Ford to a stop. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the fields that would soon be greener than they had been in generations. He walked inside, the silence no longer heavy, but serene. The safe sat on his workbench, now just a hollowed-out shell, its purpose fulfilled. He touched the scorched metal one last time, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. The laughter at the auction had been real, but it had been born of ignorance. They had looked at the safe and seen a pile of garbage. They had looked at Silas and seen a failure. They had looked at the valley and seen a resource to be plundered. They had been wrong about everything. Silas leaned against his workbench, looking out at the vast, quiet expanse of his fields. The truth had finally been returned to the earth, and for the first time in his life, he didn't just feel like a farmer. He felt like a guardian. The night was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that followed a storm, where the air was clear, the soil was ready, and the future was finally, truly, in their own hands.